We're going to get Bruce DeMaeyer rolling up here real quick like.
Thank you very much, guys. I am very privileged to present this presentation to you today. I have done a couple of them here in the past. I did some when I was in Division 10. I did a monthly clinic on this subject, and I did a presentation that was a little bit more improved from it at the Louisville MCR Regional Convention. It formed an understanding of how signaling can be demonstrated in model railroading. And that's been sort of a passion of mine since then. In a complexity disclaimer, signaling is a very complicated subject. It's very confusing in the real world, but can and should be much and less so in the modeling world. And my goal is to make the concepts easier for you to understand and easier to apply to your layout. Why signals? Why are they important? In the prototype, it's obviously necessary to help trains move safely. They allow a density of traffic to take place at its maximum amount, and it protects following trains. But in modeling, property and lives are not at stake, but signals are a great benefit and a lot of fun for the model railroad operator and the people who come to visit your layout. Generally, in the real world, there are two different sets of operating rules that are applied to almost everything in the North American complex. G-Corps, up to its 8th edition now, in April of 2018, there probably is another one coming out very shortly. That is a set of operating rules that is used by all the class 1s basically west of the Mississippi River. Most of the class 2s and many of the short line railroads. NORAC is a slightly modified version that is a set of operating rules used basically by the Northeast United States. So your railroad, your prototype, will be in one of those two. In my layout, there will be 3 different types of signaling. There is something that I call, and I've learned from the modeling world, it's the best definition of something called speed signaling, which is the signaling that takes place out in the country when the train is moving between 2 distant places. Then there is interlocking signaling, which is around all of the yards. And some people also call that, and I did in my earlier clinics, call it route signaling. But I think interlocking signaling is a better definition. And then there's yard signaling, which is not going to be covered in this clinic, but what I will have on my layout. I'll do that in a later period. In speed signaling, remember, this is the one that's out in the wild area. Trains generally cannot exceed the speed listed in the timetable. It considers the upcoming segment of track, the next set of track that's within the block in front of the train. And the engineer must govern the train speed accordingly. Interlocking signals basically govern the use of interlocking routes in a more complex area of the layout, which is typically in an area where there's going to be a lot of switching and or yard interaction or some of those kind of things, possibly a crossing route. Some of those are all done by using interlocking signals. And the interlocking name, I believe, comes from the fact that previously that was done in a yard tower with a bunch of levers and all that kind of stuff. And those were all interlocked together to make things happen smoothly. But basically it is a single fact of a diverging or straight route, each having a predictable range of known speeds. There are in this current world a lot of different types of signaling systems. There's the automatic block system. There's the permissive block system, centralized traffic control, and direct traffic control. And they're all well defined in any of the switching books that you can get. But it is what begins to make the subject very complex. And so how do we do something that removes some of that complexity? In my instance, I am building a layout that has modern double track. And usually double track is signaled for operation in only one direction, but two main tracks has bidirectional signaling. And the major difference is how the segment is dispatched. And as I said earlier, it's going to be my form of signaling. So double main with the ability to signal on either of the two mains. Double track systems have a preferred travel direction. You will hear it described in a number of different terminologies, but typically it's right hand running or left hand running. And almost all of the Western railroads that are modeled by most of us are right hand running. An exception to that is the Chicago Northwestern in Chicago, which does a left-hand running. And still, after the merger of Northwestern into the fields of United Pacific, it is still done as a left-hand running system. It affects the ways stations are put in place and all of those kind of things. So it's complex. The track has to be signaled in the direction of the preferred travel direction, of course. As I said, right-hand running is most common, and it requires a lot of additional traffic control, train order, track warrant controls, and so on, to continue to make it work in real life. So CTC 2 main track, the big continental systems, which I'm modeling on my layout, BNSF and UP use double or even triple tracked bidirectional dispatching, but it requires extreme commitments to fully control them with CTC and now the new PTC, positive train control. The track setup can be changed every few miles, the track setup, so double crossovers rule the territory and may be located as close as 10 miles to each other. So you have on this double set of tracks, double crossovers that are taking traffic from being right-hand running to being left-hand running to allow a fast express freight train to be able to bypass a slower manifest. And all of that requires signaling to be able to make that happen safely. The dispatcher is totally in charge of this, and the engineer simply follows the signals. And officially in the G-Core, N-Core thing, it's Rule 261 that governs the activity within the system. And this will be the rule under which my layout will operate. It is going to be very complex in making this all happen. And I'm really looking forward to trying to figure out how I can keep it as close as I can to the prototype. There are properties of the signals that every one of us have read in the books, and I'll repeat here what I think they really mean. Aspect of a signal describes what's displayed. For example, red over green. That's an aspect. The name of the signal property is the formal name classification for that signal. For example, a diverging clear. The indication is the information that's conveyed by the signal. For example, stop before passing the signal. So all of those things are put together, and in the engineer's mind, by reading these signals, he's able to control his train according to the rules of their operation. Here's an example of the signal aspects and indications that can exist. And I'll show you in the next slide how bad this can get, okay? There are the names that I talked about earlier: clear, approach, slow approach, and so on. There's the aspects, and there you see, not as a definition of a set of signals, but each one of the colored dots is the entirety of the signal itself. So if you're using 3 light D-type signalings, the little green button on the far left-hand side of the upper one would actually be 3 different lights, but 2 of them would not be lit. Okay, so there's the current Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway signal rules. Look at them all. It's enough to drive you absolutely totally crazy. And why does this happen? Why has this happened? It's because of all of the mergers and acquisitions that have taken place from the good old days of the Santa Fe and the Great Northern. All of the combinations of different things have to stay in place, because inside of the merger and acquisition, there is a group of engineers that are trained on how that all works. And so, yes.
I asked this same question in 2017 at your last presentation. Do all of the indications on that sheet represent the same thing? Are they all different?
No, they really do represent. For example, they have the same clear. Notice the third column. They're all clear.
On that page, say clear.
Everything that's on the left-hand side, the top bar, that is boxed in by the 2 vertical rows, represents clear. So if you get a single green or a green over red or a whatever, that's a clear. Now, if you go down 1 step to approach limited, there's only 1 in the BNSF, yellow over green. And the next one is the worst one. It's filled approach medium as shown there. So the answer is yes, every one of them that's in that box, one box is represented by the one term called clear.
Bruce, let me help you out.
Yeah, is there a
Yeah, but I'm not going to ask you to do it. So, whoops, here we go. I think I can do this.
Yeah.
There you go.
Does that help?
That help?
Does that help, Bob?
In the top left box
So everything up here where I'm moving the mouse across
means the same thing.
Means the same thing.
That's right. Just like,
Go down 3.
hang on,
Go down 3.
hang on. This is where it gets squirrely sometimes. I hate doing that sometimes. There we go.
One more. Right there,
Approach
this one?
medium.
right there.
Those are all the same.
That all means the same thing in that little block.
Yes. Now they're not all going to be on the same railroad.
On the BNSF.
They're on the BNSF from, one corner of the country to the other, because BNSF
Goes everywhere.
pardon? I'm sorry.
They go everywhere.
They go everywhere, but they go there because they have taken over somebody else's railroad, and they got to keep that inventory of information, because if you're a engineer, you're only doing that on your own railroad. As an example, under Union Pacific, the Missouri Pacific has its specific routes. Chicago Northwestern has its specific routes. So those guys know the rules way back from Chicago Northwestern. And in an extremely archaic way, in my opinion, they've maintained these kind of things, which is why I opened up the whole subject of this discussion as being very complex. I don't think this, it's not necessary to do this, but it doesn't matter because in G Core, they're all listed. Okay. So my layout will be reduced to this simple amount of signaling.
Thank you, Bruce.
And I think all of us should think of it in the same way. That you want this to be simple. You want it to be demonstratable to the engineers who are operating on your layout. And you want the people who are coming to visit your layout to see it operate. They want it to be something quite simple. Okay. And so there will be these 5 absolute stops: approach, clear, diverging approach, and diverging clear. Those will be the dominant displays of my aspects. Absolute signals. What is meant by an absolute signal? It is usually connected to interlocking segments and controlled by a dispatcher, with the most restrictive being stop. And the trains for no reason whatsoever can pass them without specific authority. In speed signaling, there can be a red stop, but it means stop and proceed. Because after you come to the stop, it's okay to proceed as long as you can stop in that block within the sight distance of the line. And that keeps traffic moving. So red doesn't always mean stop. It means do something special. But absolute stock is usually controlled because there's an A or something like that on the signal mast that tells you this is an absolute stop. And for interlocking, and you'll see that later, it's a very important element. The automatic signaling, the best example I can give of this is what Russ is doing on his signaling in his layout. It's absolutely amazing. It's governed by logically connected electrical connections through the track circuits. The most restrictive is restricted proceed, means stop and proceed at a restricted speed. Now, maybe you've learned this for the first time today, but this is an ordinary event, that restricted proceed. Okay? The least restrictive is green, which is proceed at maximum authorized speed from the timetable. And that in the Western world can be as much as 70 miles an hour for the class 1 track that's involved in most of them. Signals usually, most always, I think, display some kind of a number board. And in most cases, it's the mileage post number. Slightly off because every signal has to have a different number. And you can't on the same mast have a 1, 2, and 3 with it being the absolute distance from someplace, but that's what that is. Track permits. On my layout, a train leaving staging will occupy main track between specific points. That departure is controlled by a track permit. Track permit authorities can be issued en route to vary that rule when limits are clearly defined inside of that track permit change. Track permit authority changes must be recorded by the train operator and repeated back to the dispatcher. So if you've ever listened to a radio transmission in today's world, the dispatcher will read the permit authority change, and the engineer will read it back, and they will go all the way through the detail of actually spelling out the word one, O-N-E, so that it's very clear that everybody understands what the dispatcher has allowed the engineer to do. The dispatcher has to maintain a record of that authority granted, and there will be a record of that theoretically for a very long time kept in record vault. My interlocking controls, and I'm going to get into that in a few minutes, are interconnected, so each of their movements follows each other in a proper sequence. And interlockings that operated before with the levers all did the switch changes all at the same time. Well, that's not how my layout's going to work, because I'm using JMRI and I'm going to be operating the switches in a sequence. Very close to full real time, but not exactly like it would be if it was on the prototype. Here's my dispatcher track diagram. Don't worry about the detail of it, but it displays the lower level in black as my staging yard, and you'll notice everything comes out of my staging yard through a 6-layer helix and up to the top to a point called outbound hold. So the trains will sit there waiting to get onto the double main. Okay, and then I have 3 yards. I have the Bud yard, I have the Whitefish yard, and I have the Columbia Falls yard. And I have a huge interlocking that's at the beginning that's called the Bud interlocking. And the purpose of that is to allow trains coming out of staging to go either direction on main 1 or main 2, go east or west. It's complicated. Okay, there's my interlockings, as I just said. I'm going to be using 2-headed signals, okay? So there's 2 heads on each of the signals in the interlocking world, and a single head system in speed signaling, there'll only be 1. There's no reason to have 1 because you're not doing any diverging anywhere on speed signaling. It's just staying on the track you're on. All red means stop. That's universal. For all the other aspects, the general principle is that green on top means that the main route or normal speed and red, and that should be main route and normal speed, and red over green or yellow indicates the diverging route and a medium speed. Okay, here's the beginning of my definition of how I do interlocking. Notice that a train coming out of the staging yard has stopped at outbound hold. And that train is very specifically defined as being a westbound or an eastbound train. And think of my yard as being a combination of Chicago and the West Coast area. So any train going from Chicago to the West Coast comes through that line, through that outbound hold. My staging yard then is really a representation of everything outside of the layout, as opposed to what most people use a staging yard for. Mine is different. So a train will be coming from Chicago. It's going westbound, and it's going to come on the outbound hold, and it's going to have the ability to go through crossovers. Notice there's double crossovers protecting both sides of the interlocking, and then a big, huge reversing interlock, which in DCC requires me to have, reversing control, power reversing control. But notice also I have another yard on the interlock, on the reversing interlock. This was a change, just a major change from what I did in Versailles on my earlier layout. I designed this way, but it was absolutely a nightmare from an operating standpoint to try to figure out how to use it. That's all been fixed. In the months that I've had to think about what I wanted to do, it's now resolved in my mind on how to get it done. Okay, so the Bud interlocking scope is providing inbound and outbound access to the staging yard. And it involves the use of a reversing loop, as I said, for westbound incoming and eastbound outgoing trains. The Bud interlocking scope, this is a plus on the previous slide, is used to allow operations independently of the reversing loop. That was what I couldn't do before. The minute I brought somebody into the Bud yard, I messed up the ability to use the reversing loop as long as that train was operating and doing its switching in that loop, which meant that my mains could not properly operate with new trains coming in and old trains going out. And that's been fixed now. Okay, the other yards with interlocking, much more ordinary. And you'll see here that it's Whitefish and Columbia Falls are set with double crossovers on both sides and a input to the yard in both instances, and a unique aspect of Whitefish having a Whitefish depot and a Whitefish crew change, because that's where I'm going to demonstrate the ability to bring trains into sidings and delay and all of those kind of things, and then in an operation sense. Okay, so what's the complexity of running this bud interlocking? Okay, if your train that you're bringing up out of the staging area is an outbound west heading train, Chicago to Seattle, for example. You come out of the outbound hold and you immediately encounter CPM1, which gets you onto the main number 2 track, but that track is the eastbound track. So in order to reverse the direction of that train to continue out on the westbound lead, you have to go through CP1, follow on the bottom, CP1 M1, CPM2X, the double crossover, M3, the entrance into the interlock, and M5, which is at the outside edge of the interlock. All of those switches have to be thrown by JMRI to begin the process of allowing a train to come in. But before that all began, notice where I've got the A's, the 2 A's in the top and the bottom. Those signals go red. So if there's any trains that are operating on the main number 1 or main number 2, they absolutely have to stop before they get to that point so that the interlocking can work on the train that I'm bringing out of the staging area. When the train is fully inside of the reversing section, now this isn't normally something that would be in prototype, but because of DCC, my train has to be completely inside of the reversing loop before I can make any changes in this, because I want that thing to, I want the power to be reversed when it gets to M5, CPM5. So the train is proceeding from the outbound hold through M1, through M2, through M3, up across M4, which has the A and B sections because there's a yard in there, and then back around on M5, and now it's heading westbound on main number 1. But CPM3 is thrown in the wrong direction. So now I have to go and I have to activate another transaction with JMRI to prepare the train for now departing on main 1 and close all those other things that I did to get it in. So this is complex, and it's going to be a very interesting series of steps that I have to take inside of JMRI to make that all work. Outbound east is easy peasy, okay? Because you come out of the outbound hold onto main number 1, main number 2, and main number 2 is in eastbound direction. So all you really have to do is throw CPM1 and you're in ready to go. But you still have to operate the absolute stops on the track so that you don't have another train colliding with you because of the fact they're in there running. And that was my point earlier about the fact that that absolute stop is very important. Okay, on inbound east, it's a reverse of, I'm not going to go through all the detail of it, but it's a reverse of what I did on the other one. And inbound west is the other easy peasy. That just lets you go in and go through. So there's 4 different possibilities that any one of these trains can do, and you've just seen the actions that need to be taken for each of those 4. Back to the track diagram so that you can remember what we're talking about. There's the outbound hold, there's the interlocking, and we've talked in detail about it. But we haven't talked much about Whitefish and Columbia Falls. But I'll get to those in a minute. Speed signals are going to be used. I'm going to use optical signaling. Interesting part of this clinic was my original proposal to Russ came as a result of the guy from Dwarven talking about using fiber optics for signaling and for the other. And I was going to try to demonstrate how we could use fiber optics to do this. And I got to tell you, it is a big lose in comparing the commercial costs of doing it with wires versus fiber optics. There is almost no practical way of doing this with fiber optics. Okay, because remember, in that clinic he gave us, he's lighting a whole bunch of lights at one time from one source. I'm operating one light at a time. And the controllers on this thing, he can do it and he's selling it right now, but you got to buy a lot of controllers to make it work. So to make this all happen is very, very typical. You know, I remember it's bidirectional, so you can see my little symbol for the signal lights, both directions. There will be a typical optical detector detecting, you know, the fact that there's something entering the block, and then the other ones are down along the line. Those subsequent yellow and green are going to be time controlled. Now, let me tell you why I'm doing that. This is for the pleasure of the operator and for the pleasure of the viewer to see the lights changing appropriately. But there's no way that you could economically and maybe even electronically perfect that whole thing so that when the first train goes through the second optical detector that's shown there, the light on the previous one goes to yellow. And the logic that you have to do to make that all happen is incredible. So I'm taking some liberties here. I'm gonna say that first signal stays lit at green or red when the train goes past it for some amount of time. Let's say 30 seconds. And at the end of 30 seconds, it's going to turn yellow. And at the end of another 30 seconds, it's going to turn green. And that Arduino can do beautifully because Arduino is a timer circuit, basically. So I'm giving up on the ability to absolutely unequivocally mark that whole thing. I mean, it's so complex that if you use plastic wheels, your last car's got to have metal wheels. I mean, it just boggles your mind what you have to do to make it all work. So I'm faking it, okay? So here's the progression of aspects. Train number 1 is ahead of train number 2 on the left. Train number 2 is entering block 1, and there is a stop and proceed issue with a red light issued for that track. Block number 2 is showing green, clear. Block number 3 is showing approach. And block number 4 is showing stop and proceed, because within those 4 blocks, you now have 2 trains operating. So where will those speed signals be? They will be in the areas in between the interlockings. I can get 3 of them on the section over by tunnel number 1. I can get 3 of them on the section between the upper yard and the lower yard crossovers. And in between, that's all interlocking at the far left-hand lower side. Okay, I'm going to use a product. I'm in N scale, so I have a little bit of a difficulty in getting the number of wires that you need to get for all of the LEDs down through a mast and down underneath the deck comfortably. And I have made a decision to use Showcase Miniatures signal ground masks. They look like what you see on the right-hand side, and they're all made out of etched metal, and the diagram ABC shows you how to bend those various pieces to be able to build that unit. In my case, I'm going to have 4 heads on each mast. Unless that's very impractical from a design standpoint where I need to put a second one facing the other direction. Okay, because remember, I've got signals going in both directions. There will also be bridge mounting, and the bridge mounting is done by their signal bridge with an expansion possibility in the middle that allows you to cover 3 tracks, which is the most I've got. And then it's got mast mounts on it that you glue the signals to it, and so on. So my signal head positioned on a bridge mast is going to look like this. The upper structural member of that bridge and that individual signal post will have a head on it. Most of them will have 2 heads on the same mast, and all of that's going to be soldered to the bridge structure, glued and soldered and all that kind of stuff. And that's what it will look like. And that's the kind of signal I'm using, D-type signal heads. So all of this has now been, while I was ill, this is all what I put my brains around to try to keep myself and my brain alive while I was doing all of that. And, but I was not physically able to do very much on the layout during that period. So most of the time was spent planning the layout. My major mountain scenery from Versailles is now in place on the layout, and I need to build the sections between the layout and the bottom with rocks and filled in and all that kind of stuff. So I've still got plenty of work to do on the mountain scenery itself. My helix and my incline ramps are installed on the layout. Some of the track is now in place. So I have to finish the mountain scenery, and I have to complete phase 1 of the track layout and begin work on my expected structure masterpiece, which is a perfect representation of what the Whitefish Depot looks like. And if ever any of you have ever been to Whitefish, Montana, and seen that depot, it's absolutely spectacular. So that's my goal. I'm hoping to have the Whitefish Depot finished by Pittsburgh so that I can take it up and demonstrate it. I'm not going to enter it in the contest. The contest at Indianapolis frosted me on that whole thing, and so I'm not going to involve myself in judging anymore at any of the regional or national conventions. So be it. So questions, a lot of material. Any questions? Thanks a lot for your patience, and I hope I've given you some input.
Nicely done, Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Okay, friends. That's it for you at home and you in the room. Thanks for coming today. We'll see you soon.